Good evening, and thank you for those of you who can stay. That was an incredibly powerful film, don't you think? Yeah.
Thank you.
As Deborah mentioned, when we first started talking about the Black Lens, this series, we wanted to bring to life our history. That symbol, the Sankofa symbol, has a bird's feet facing forward but head turned backward, because it is understood, this is an African tradition, that you have to know your history before you walk forward. And what Stanley has done through many films is to take a look at African American history, part of American history, to let us understand our history. And when I watched this film, one of the things that struck me is how pertinent it is right now. The messages were, it was like it was today, except for people were dressed a little differently and their afros might have been bigger. So Stanley, in making this film, because it was so emotional, I'm curious for you as the filmmaker, going into the history and bringing forth the stories of the development of the party and the things that they were facing. How do you as a filmmaker deal with all of that content coming at you and having to edit through it, the emotional experience of being a director and putting this together? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens in making a film is that, being a filmmaker takes over. And so a lot of the emotion involved in the material kind of slides away. You're trying to tell a story and you're just trying to tell it as well as you can. So, and convey as much emotion as you can, but it's not like it's seeping into my head, or I hope it's not. I think one of the big things about the Panthers was there was so much visual material for us, and that made, in some ways, our job easier, because there were so many pictures and so much footage, but it made it harder because we had to figure out what to use and what we couldn't use.
We heard a very different story about the Second Amendment and guns. They shouldn't have those guns. We need to change the law. And you think about what we're hearing today. Talk about that, just this notion that the Black Panthers, that Huey Newton understood the law because he was studying law and understood that it was legal to carry, and what that meant, the impact of these young black people exercising their right to bear arms. And please compare it to today.
I think one of the things that happens with the Black Panthers is, we forget, what it was like before that. For me growing up, and I was 15 or so when the Panthers came into being. So, and I was in New York. I grew up in New York City, so I was like the Panthers' target audience. That's who they wanted. We had never seen, a black man put his finger in the face of a white man. We had never seen that before, and so it's hard to understand if you're younger than that was something that we didn't see, that somebody, no, I'm not, you didn't see that from Martin Luther King, you didn't see that from the nonviolent civil rights movement. So for many people, this was like, oh my God, I've never seen that before. This is something different. And that's what the Panthers represented for so many of us. I think one of the things that I wanted to do, and I think is once you start looking at the Panther story, is it's a very different story that we tell in the film than has come down through history. And I think that's the story that we wanted to tell. We wanted it as much as we could to be from the inside. We wanted it to be what they called the rank and file. Why would somebody join the Panthers? Why would they stay in the Panthers? And why would they leave the Panthers? And in what world are those rational decisions? And we wanted to try to tell that story in the film. There's no way you can tell the Panther story without talking about Huey and Bobby and Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver and those people. But also what about the rank and file? And that's kind of one of the things we wanted to center on in this story.
Well, you mentioned what happened before. And I've talked to a lot of older black people from the South in particular, or who have family in the South, and they will tell you the story that at least down South, if you were black, you were not allowed to look in the eye of a white person. You could get arrested for that. And the notion that you would point your finger and carry a weapon was something unheard of. And again, because I do want us to give some context to today. Today, the argument about weapons is different. We go back to this uncomfortable conversation about white supremacy, which is rearing its head again today. And if you remember, I think it was in Montana not long ago, where the folks had lots of weapons and they didn't even get arrested. The cops just waited them out. It's a different story.
Well, I mean, I always wonder what would happen, if in these states that have these open carry laws. Now, if you have a group of young black men and black women, open carrying guns, and what happens then? And it's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen. There is a new Black Panther Party, and there are people who, are advocating that. So, I mean, what's the final end? I mean, I heard that one of the things that was said was that the synagogue would have been protected if they had guns.
One of the things that the president said.
Yeah,
yes.
One of the things that the president said, which is, I mean, think about how ridiculous that is,
Well, and there were police officers there,
Yeah.
trained, who were shot.
Yeah. So I mean, I just think, what's the end all of, what's the end game of all this talk and these laws that we're passing that are allowing, people legally to carry guns, in schools and other places, I mean, I know that I'm glad that when I grew up, some of my teachers didn't have guns. I personally wouldn't be here.
Well, and you say what's the end game? And I think about other films that you've made. You made a film about Emmett Till, the young man who was wrongfully murdered, and because of Jet Magazine showing because his mother wanted an open casket so that his body could be seen, and Jet Magazine ran that image, people got to see what happened. You've done a lot of films documenting the twists and turns in our history. When we look at today, do we feel, how far have we come? When you look through your films, what do you see in terms of the movement of time?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, when I did Murder of Emmett Till, Freedom Riders, Freedom Summer, which are all about the 50s and the 60s. I mean, obviously we've come a long way. I'm not going to be one of those people that sits up here and say, we haven't come anywhere, because we've come a long way. How far have we actually come? Right? I mean, I think for a lot of us, we haven't come as far as we thought we had come 2 years ago. Right. 2 years ago, we thought we had, and so we have to look around and say, where have we really come? And I think that's what's really important. As a country, as a people. So I mean, we've come a long way, but we're not far enough.
People often are afraid when they think of the Black Panthers. Without knowing the story, I think after watching the film, didn't you learn a lot about them? Probably that you didn't know. But there is this sense of fear about who they were, and we got to see at the end, and you touched on it image-wise, but I'd like you to talk about it a little bit, when Huey P. Newton kind of just lost himself, and drugs, as Erica Huggins said, were a big part of that. That's also something that's cyclical in our communities. Back at that time, there were so many smart young black men who were clear-minded, and then drugs flooded into our communities. Can you talk about what happened to him and what that the impact of that is for our culture?
What happened to Huey?
Yep.
Well, I mean, I think the film, shows. I mean, Huey, undoubtedly deteriorated into drugs, and it affected who he was. I think that, as someone says in the film, you don't know if this is really what Huey wanted. I mean, the Black Panther Party was a group of 5 people. There's a picture in the beginning where there are 5 people in a yard. Huey and Bobby and Big Man and Little Bobby Hutton and the Forte brothers. 6, I guess that is. But they were just and they said, we got to do something about the police. And it developed into this thing, and I don't know if it had gotten way too big for Huey when he got out of jail, or what his demons were, but they were certainly there. But I think what's really important to me is in some ways is that this whole movement, and I think that it was a movement, and I think it did have a lasting effect, a cultural effect, if it didn't have a real political effect, but it did have a cultural effect. Started, by 6 young men, 6 young people, and took off from there. And it's really important that young people today understand that they can make change. And I think that's what's really important, because, what happens today is the news and social media is telling young people in very subtle ways that there's no way that you can make a difference, that you can't make a difference. And I think it's really important that the Panthers are a lesson that you can do something, and they seized the time and seized the day, and that's really important. They were ultimately defeated, but I think culturally it started this big shift, in Black thought, and in Black people think about who they are and their relationship to white America.
Well, and the most recent galvanizing force, I think, was with Black Lives Matter, where it started small and got big, and we have an election before us. And there is the question as to whether that galvanizing factor is going to push people to the polls. And back during the time of the Black Panthers, they did so much for the community, feeding the children, trying to be a force for positive change within the community, and also just to stand up. And they got but so far. And I just wonder your thoughts, based upon your documentation of our history over all these years. What are your thoughts about next steps now?
I mean, I think it's up to young people. I mean, I show films and speak at a lot of high schools and colleges, and I'm like, it's your turn. Young people are going to be around for 50, 60, 70 years. I'm not. A lot of other people in here will not. But if it's your world, and so you have to understand that you can make this world, and it's up to you to try to make the world that you want to live in, and that you do have some control, and you can make change. But also, one of the things that I found in making this film and Freedom Riders and Freedom Summer, these are all films that I made about movements, is that it changes the people who are involved. It changes them. These people stay connected. It changes who they are, 30 and 40 and 50 years later, because they were part of something that was bigger than themselves. And I think that's something that we all want. We made a film called Jonestown, The Life and Death of People's Temple, about Jim Jones. And that was one thing that the people in People's Temple wanted. Whether it worked out, whether it was a tragic ending, but they did want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think that's something that's in us as humans. We want to be part of something. I think young people can be part of something. I think that one of the things that we have to understand, though, it was that in the 60s and 70s, it was a lot easier. It wasn't like you had to be Martin Luther King. When I was growing up, there was an anti-war movement because we were in the war in Vietnam, and you'd be in high school or on a Friday afternoon, and you'd be saying to one of the women, so what are you doing this weekend? And they'd be like, I'm going on the march. And what are you doing, Stanley? I'm going on the march. That's what I was going to do. And so it was a lot easier because those things were happening.
Well, and we can argue that there have been many marches, And in fact, one of the things in your film that you showed was how important women were in the Panther Party. And we will remember 2 years ago, the day after inauguration, was that giant women's march that was all over the United States and beyond. You mentioned young people and the need for them to take action. And I know, I live in Harlem, I talk to young people a lot. I'll walk up to them sometimes and ask, what are their dreams? What do you want to do with your life? Especially young black men. And sadly, the answer is usually, huh? What am I dreaming? I'm not dreaming about anything. I don't know what I'm going to do next. And I'm curious, there are a lot of young people here. I'm curious, you are making films that help people to notice what's going on in the world, what has occurred. What advice would you have for young people that might ignite that fire if it's not already ignited?
I mean, I think for young people, I mean, I found it, you know, kind of a different story. I found, you know, in traveling around that young people aren't really apathetic. They just don't know, you know, they're confused about what's going on, you know, and what to do and what to join. I think they're not so apathetic. I think just, you know, stay in the world. That's the main thing, you know, it's just stay in the world, and, you know, you never know. I mean, if you had asked me when I was 18 or 19, would I be in Stanford sitting on the front of the stage showing a film that I had made about the Black Panthers, I would have said, you're out of your mind, you know? So, I mean, you just never know. I mean, as we all know here, you know, especially people, you know, who are a little older, you know, it's a long life. And you don't know what's going to happen. Just keep your mind and your heart open, and you know, the possibilities are there, and you know, it can happen. That's what I think.
I like the hope in there. As we are talking, if people have questions, where shall they be? Do you want them to come up?
Mics will go around. We have circulating mics, so just raise your hand.
So yes, raise your hand if you have a question.
Raise your hand high.
And then when you do, if you would say your name and then ask a question. If you raise your hand, we can begin questions, because I know that it's late. If you have one right here. Yes, please.
I do. Before the film started, I said I had a question for you, but of course after the film it's completely changed. Brilliant film. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm sitting here, brilliant film. My question as I was viewing the film, during that time period, in every city you had young African American youth organizing in some way, shape, or form. They felt the need to stand up. They felt the need to express themselves. But Oakland seemed to be extremely unique in terms of these young men who organized in the way that they did, who came together in the way that they did. You can't tell everything about the young men that you portrayed in the film, but most of them were college educated or attending college. Many of them had served their country. They were veterans. So what was it about Oakland that created this particular group of young black men and this modality of speaking out, standing up, activating collective agency? What was it about this particular space that created these young men in the way that it did?
That's a great question. You know, there's a couple of books, I'm sorry I forget the titles, but there are a couple of books about the Panthers and Oakland and why Oakland. I think that, you know, there's a couple of reasons. One, Oakland at that point was a black city. It was a black city, and it had this repressive, horrible police force. So it had those two things going. And then also the people from Oakland, this generation, you know, Huey and Bobby and them, basically their parents were from the South, and they had moved to Oakland for jobs. So they had jobs, and they had a kind of stable community there because they had moved there to work. There's a big shipping yards in Oakland. And so they came out of that era. But I also think one of the things that happened, you know, in all cities at that point, a couple of things is, one, that Harriet alluded to, is that the drugs had not proliferated. You know, so you had all these young, you know, black men and women who were not on drugs, you know, who you know, were strong and were not on drugs. And then you had the Vietnam War going on. And what the Vietnam War did for everybody was politicized everybody. Everybody, you had to choose a side. Because if you were a man, you were either going or you weren't. If you were a woman, your brother, your lover, your cousin was going or had been killed or came back crazy. And we all saw that. Every single person, who was of age at that point had a plan. Everybody, you either going to go into the army, or you were going to go to Canada, or you were going to go underground. Everybody had a plan, and so it wasn't like you could ignore what was going on, which people can do today, so I think that all of those things kind of were happening at once, and you're coming out of this civil rights movement, and you're coming out of this movement that was basically a Southern movement. And the thing about the Panthers they were basically a Northern movement. So there was almost this feeling of like, what about us, right? What about us in the North? We have our problems, and there's nobody, really talking about that. Now that's a simplification of what happened, obviously. And Martin Luther King, when he was killed, was moving into the North. But there was that all of those things, I think, led to this the Black Panther Party, and also there was this feeling that that nonviolence was not working. As I was talking to Harriet at dinner, and I was saying that the film that we did right before this, Freedom Summer, was about voting and about the what happened at the Democratic National Convention in '64, and what happened, and it ends with Stokely Carmichael standing up on that truck yelling "Black Power, Black Power, Black Power," because everybody is so disillusioned by what happened at the convention, and then this film kind of starts with Stokely up on that truck.
And I just want to add, just for context, you remember in the film, early on, there was someone who said, we were in California, but it was the same as in the South. And because of the Great Migration that included moving to the West, and as you mentioned, these people had jobs. People had moved from the South to have better treatment, to have better jobs. They got the jobs, some of them, but the same experiences traveled with them, and I think that was disappointing and shocking, and at a certain point, unacceptable.
Right, and the Oakland and the Northern California Police Department, the LA Police Department, actually recruited white Southerners to be cops, and that's who the police force was. It was a very, very rough police force out there in California.
Next, yes. And please say your name.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a teacher. I work and live in Stanford, and I'm actually using your documentary, Mr. Nelson, to teach Rita Williams Garcia's book, One Crazy Summer, which is about her kind of exposure and experience with the Panthers. So I think you've actually done a phenomenal job of beginning to answer this already, but I was wondering what words you might have specifically for fifth graders, 11-year-olds, who are already hooked on this story and want more like it, and for whom this film and that book mean a great deal. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that young people look at the Panthers, with open eyes. I mean, I think that one of the things, that we found when we went around, we went all around the country screening this film because it had a theatrical release, and there were people who would get up and want to argue about Huey, and like, that wasn't Huey. Huey was this, And then we're like, no, that is Huey, and the film has no narration. I don't say anything about Huey in the film. We interview people who talk about their experiences with Huey and the Panthers. And so, I think that the film clearly talks about the problems of the Panthers. I mean, look, what were they going to do? They overthrow the government? It was never going to that wasn't going to happen. But, there are lessons in the Panthers, especially for organizing. Especially especially for being involved. I mean, again, there's a group of 6 people who became this kind of phenomena that we're still sitting here however many years later talking about them. And I think that's really important for young people, and for young people to understand that they can get involved and that they can make change. And if they don't make it, who can? And you can't believe the media that tells you, go, play Xbox, or go, get on your phone, or go Snapchat, or, and just forget it. You can't do anything. You can. I think that's really important.
And the fact that you're teaching about the Panthers to fifth graders, we should commend you, definitely, because it doesn't happen in a lot of schools. So thank you for doing that. Is another question?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Amazing.
What's your name?
My name is Cheryl. I live here in Stamford, just moved up from the city. And I just have to say that I love the way you humanized each of the people that were part of the story. And I could almost see a documentary on each and every one of those people. So maybe you'll do that. But the real question that I have is about Eldridge Cleaver. I was a college student when Soul on Ice came out, and we all walked around with it in our hands and talked about it. And I am surprised at the transformation that he took later in life. And I was wondering if you had any insights into why the support of Ronald Reagan and his subsequent shift versus where he started. Thank you.
So, I did a lot of screenings with Kathleen Cleaver, who actually is just incredible in the way that, she's morphed. She's a law professor at Emory and other places, and the way she's morphed and given herself a productive life after this. Somebody asked that same question, and her answer was mental illness. So that was that was it. I think Eldridge Cleaver was, obviously, immensely smart, but Eldridge Cleaver had spent something like, I forgot his age, let's say he was 30 or something. He had spent half his life in jail, and I think that has an effect, and as somebody said, Eldridge Cleaver was the top dog in jail. That's the guy he was. And he was what we call Mau Mau, and all the black people in here understand what that is, that he was a Mau Mau, and that's the person who jumps up on the table and starts, pounding the desk, and, if there's a whole group of people, they follow that person because they're talking the loudest. But I think Eldridge Cleaver, had real problems and really was nihilistic, and really wanted violent confrontation, and I think that one of the things that hopefully the film says is that the Panthers weren't they weren't angels, there were people, Eldridge Cleaver was very dangerous in some ways, but also hugely smart, and that doesn't mean that a lot of things that he said weren't really fascinating.
And interesting how history plays out. Today, this evening, I saw a news flash on my phone. I don't know if any of you saw that Kanye just made a turnabout saying that he realizes now that there are many, he himself has said that he suffers from mental illness, but he says that he realized that he's been used in this political moment in time. And when we saw Eldridge Cleaver up there supporting Ronald Reagan, and that came across my phone, I thought that was something to take note of. Next question.
Hi, my name is Valerie Cooper, and I'd like to, I'm a native of Stamford. I'd like to personally thank Stan for coming to our town. I've seen you on the Vineyard over the years, love all of your movies, and this was phenomenal. As a product of the Stamford public school system, I, unlike the fifth grade teacher, didn't have a teacher that taught me anything about the Black Panthers, but I did learn what I thought I knew through the media. And in my impression, Angela Davis was the Black Panther woman that I felt was most prominent. So she was very visibly missing for me from this film. And I'd like to ask, what was her role really? Because obviously I've been misled to think she played a much larger role than she did, and in fact, we didn't see her at all.
Thank you for that question. I mean, that's the one question that I get everywhere I've ever shown this film. Angela Davis was not a member of the Black Panther Party. And so
Shocking, right?
That's kind of a misconception. She was not a member of the Black Panther Party. when we were making this film, there's another film that was just coming out called Free Angela and All Political Prisoners, which is a great film. You should look for it. It's a film about Angela Davis, but she was not a member of the Black Panther Party. I saw Angela Davis, a little while after we finished the film, and I said, Angela, this is what we're saying. Is that true? She said, no, I was never a member of the Black Panther Party. I was aligned with the Black Panther Party. We believe very similar things, but I was never a member of the Black Panther Party. So, in making this kind of film, look, we could have talked about Angela and the people who are aligned with the Black Panther Party, but it just gave us an out to say, whew, okay, now we can make this film 2 hours, not 5.
Next question. Can't see. Is there anybody?
Is that it?
I'm sure there are more questions. Here's one right up here.
Hold on. They want you to speak in the mic.
Okay, my name is Greg, and first of all, I want to thank you. The film was fantastic. You had me thinking about things I haven't thought about since 1969, when I was a Panther here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So for that, I really thank you. The misconceptions that formed around the party and what we were trying to do kind of are almost universal. What I want to know is what can we do to make sure from now on, right, with the bird looking back, right, that in our schools, what this gentleman is doing here, right, and other minorities get a little bit of their history so they understand where they came from. I think until that is done, because we keep fighting for this little piece of the pie, acting like we come from different places, right? And until we understand our history and where all of our histories crosses, right, this crap is going to continue. And that's.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've made a number of films on history, and that's kind of what I'm doing. We try to get those films into schools and around as much as we possibly can, and get people to see those films. One of the things that we do is we do a lot of these kind of events and travel and with the films and talk about the films. For anybody who wants, this film is on Netflix. I think it might be the only one that's on Netflix, but you can find other films or other work that we do. Our company is Firelight Media and Firelight Films. If you go to info@firelightmedia.org, info@firelightmedia.org, you can find out more about the films that we make, and we make them available to anybody that wants to see them, and try to get them to young people as much as we possibly can.
Well, and here's where thank you. Here's where the political process is important. On a local level, going to the school board and asking the school board to show these films. You can reach out to Stanley's company and get the films. Many of them aired first on PBS, right? Mm-hmm. And it is true, I wanted to rewatch before coming, and I went on Netflix last night and watched the film. So you can tell anybody, everybody, and they can watch this film right now. I want to talk for a moment. Do we have another question? Yeah, where?
Hold
Okay,
on.
we're going to get a microphone to you.
You gotta have a mic.
Oh, hi.
What's
Hello.
your name?
My name is Helen Peary. I just wanted to know if we had any of our artists, such as James Brown.
What about James Brown?
James Brown.
What about
about
James
him?
Brown?
Did you have any interaction with James Brown or in the movement with him?
With
'Cause I
James Brown?
understand he fight the power to be.
No. I've never had any. I didn't have any interaction with James Brown. It's funny you should mention that, because one of the things that I've said in public was one of my dream films is to make a film about James Brown. That was like my dream project. Somebody asked me my dream project one time, for the New York Times, and I said that my dream would be to make a film about James Brown. It still is. I think there was a film that came out a couple of years ago about James Brown, so I just got to wait and let some time pass. But it still is one of my dreams, because I think James Brown, has a special place in the history of music and the history of African American music. And I would love to make a film about James Brown.
Well, and that with the riots after Dr. King's assassination, James Brown held a concert, and so people were worried that if folks would come out to the concert, it was in Philadelphia, I believe. Is that right?
Boston.
Excuse me, Boston, right. I was just talking, it was in Boston. And the police and all were afraid that if people came out to the concert, it would create more violence. What he did was to have the concert, and it was televised. And there wasn't that kind of violence in Boston where it was in other places.
I believe there's a film about that. I think it's called James Brown Saves Boston.
David Leaf. Yeah.
David Leaf.
Right.
Yeah.
she's saying,
Yeah.
So it's called James Brown Saves Boston,
One of
something
his
like that.
best films.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you you have a question?
Well, I was just going to ask what was going to happen, for school children, and you answered it. But personally, I was hoping to see you and just thank you, because you had my first cousin, Larry Rubin, interviewed in Freedom Summer, and thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
He has some great stories to tell.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Excellent. There's a question right here.
Hi, my name is Glenn. First, I love the documentary, and I love all the documentaries that you've done. I just wonder if you could give us a little bit of a hint about what's coming with the African American in business, the entrepreneurs, that documentary that you're planning. And in particular, I wonder who has inspired you more than any other. I was thinking maybe Madam C.J. Walker or someone, but could you shed some light, give us a little summary about what we can expect?
Sure. We're just finishing up a film on African Americans in business, and it's really covering businesses from the end of the Civil War on. And one of the things that we do is we kind of tell this historical story of African Americans struggling against the odds, against, in Oklahoma where the black business district was basically burned down just because white folks were jealous of the money black people were making, to laws that prohibited black people from owning certain types of businesses and those kind of things, and fighting through those odds. And as we tell this story up to the present, we also have stories of people today. So Kathy Hughes in Washington, D.C., who now owns a bunch of radio and TV stations. Ursula Burns, who started out with nothing and became the head of Xerox. Ken Frazier, who's the head of drug company Merck. So all of those things, and then those are kind of, we flash back and forth in time to tell those stories. So that's kind of a look at that. We're also finishing up a film on Miles Davis. That's just, I think I mentioned before, that's just a huge project. And then we're about to start this 4-hour series on the Atlantic slave trade and looking at the slave trade as a business, as an international business. In the New World, in Africa, in Europe, and this thing that put into place so many things that we live with today, banking, insurance, shipping, all those things. The first multinational corporations were slavers, and to look at that whole thing, and it involved, every continent except Antarctica in the world was involved in it. And it went on for, hundreds of years. It's not something that was, a bunch of pirates, stealing some people from Africa. It was a business, a huge business that was in some ways the first time that people could really engage in capitalism around the world. If you were a European person, there was no way that you could engage in the accumulation of capital, but you could, by investing in slave companies. And
Well, and isn't that part of the reason, I always like to look to the present, part of the reason why folks are having a difficult time talking about what's happening now, is that the economy is so good for some people that they don't want to look underneath the blanket to see what else is happening. I wanted to address something that some of you may know, because as Stanley has made many films, including this one, about our past, he also was very present in the most recent conversation post the Starbucks incident, when the young men, African-American men, were arrested for being in Starbucks and not buying a coffee. And Stanley made the film that was used for sensitivity training that was another shot that rang around the world, really showing how people experience everyday racism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we were contracted by Starbucks to make this film to be shown, when Starbucks shut down all their stores that day. They wanted to show a film, so we were contracted to make this film. And the heart of the film, you can look at the film if you go to YouTube and you just put in Starbucks and Stanley Nelson, it'll come up. So, we made this little 10-minute film, but the heart of the film is just, people looking straight into the camera, talking about, everyday racism that black people, experience, every single day, and is, just, from young people who are, 15, 16, talking about being followed around stores, to one guy talks about the fact that, he, when he gets on a bus, he wants to make sure that he's not too close to somebody, that, he looks a certain way, and one of the most startling things to me as a black man, and this really startled me, I mean, it really did. It startled me, was we talked to a white guy, and he, as we were researching the film, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I have never, as far as I know, in my life, been discriminated against because of the way I look. And I was like, wow. I had never thought that anybody had that experience. I mean, that's how central it is to our experience as an African American, right? And it got to the fact, of, that feeling that you have, as you go into a store and you put your hand on the door, and you're like, how am I gonna be received? And you think, and this is a guy who's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I know. And so it was just an interesting, I think, people talking about these feelings and giving people a chance to talk about that. So anyway, it's a film that we did for Starbucks. We're very proud of it. And we also talk about the history of, we go back and we talk about the history of the civil rights movement, because in a lot of ways, the civil rights movement was about equality in public spaces. It was about black people being able to go into stores. It was about black people being able to go into restaurants. It was about black people being able to go into a park or a swimming pool or a public library. It was about that feeling of wanting to be free to go into public spaces, and what we realize is that public spaces still aren't equal, that there still is an inequality, and something that we feel as black people, and it's so central to our core, our feeling as black people, that we don't even know that we feel it, if that makes any sense. It's something I can't talk to my son about. I have a 19-year-old son. I can't talk to him about it. I can't tell my son, every time I open the door to Starbucks or to Macy's or to a store, I feel a little twinge because I'm not sure how I'm gonna be treated. I can't say that, because to him I gotta be the strong guy. I'm going in there. So I think it's a very different kind of piece. It's 10 minutes again. Starbucks, Stanley Nelson will come up.
Well, I think it's worth seeing too, because in this series, as we are exploring the African American experience, one of the things that many people who are well-meaning don't have a clue about is what the experience is. I talk to friends all the time who believe that they are liberal, white New Yorkers often, I live in Manhattan, who think they're down and they understand. And when I say things, that couldn't have happened to you, Harriet. Yeah. You know, and I'm not just talking about things, you know, from long ago. But it's insidious. You know, racism is insidious, and the more we talk about the experiences that we have, the more we can open each other's eyes and have greater sensitivity and empathy. You know, I mean, still, it's hard to catch a cab. to raise your hand, and just happened to me a couple days ago. I can't tell you how many cabs rode by. Like, really?
Let me just say, you know, this happened to me yesterday. I was coming out of a meeting and I was downtown, and you know, usually I just call Uber or Lyft because I don't want to deal with yellow cabs. And I was like, oh, what? You know, there's all these cabs going by, so I'm like, why call a cab? And the cab stopped at the light. I go to open the door. The guy locks his door.
Yes.
My hand is on my hand is on the door. You know, and he starts pulling off and is going to drag me down the street, and then realizes that he can't drag me down the street, you know, because he might kill me. So he just stops. He's like halfway turned, and he just stops and sits there until and I'm knocking on the window and saying, "Open the door." And then finally, you know, he just drove off, and so I reported him.
Very good, very good.
But anyway, you know anyway.
Well, so watch the film because it is important. The level of sensitivity in listening to everyday acts of racism, I think, will open everyone's eyes. Are there other questions? So before we go, here's one right here. And before we get to that, Stanley, I want to talk about the music in the film because the music was so important. Give me 1 second, but let's talk about that. Like in the end, Bill Withers, Winter in America. I mean,
Gil Scott.
Excuse me. Thank you. Gil Scott, Winter in America. There were many times where I felt like crying, very close to tears because of the music. And choosing the right music and the timing of including it is an art form. I mean, that's your art, that you're bringing those things together. But how did you pick the music?
You know, I'm a lover of music, and so I listen to a lot of music, and I mean, I think there's a real soundtrack when you're talking about any time period. You know, there's a soundtrack of that time period, and this was a time where, you know, we heard it on the radio. You know, there were, you know, that was part of the music that we heard. So, I mean, I spent a lot of time listening to music. One of the things that's happened, you know, with Spotify is, you know, you can type in funk, and it'll, you know, and it'll have like Mississippi funk, North Carolina funk, you know, all this different, you know, music, and I just listened to a lot of it and wanted to really give a soundtrack. One of the things that was like so exciting for me when we did the theatrical distribution and this film traveled around the country is we had a thumb drive with kind of music from protest music from the 60s and the 70s, and we would play that and we'd give it to the projectionists and we'd ask them to play it, you know, as people were coming into the theater, and it just set a tone, you know, that was just really, it was really nice. It was something that we dreamed up and actually, you know, were able to make happen. And so I just think the music was really important for the film and really important for that time. And we really wanted to give a sense of the time.
That was powerful. Your question.
Hi, my name is Donna Watkin. I wanted to know what role Malcolm X played in the Black Panthers.
I think when did Malcolm X pass? He passed before the Panthers. He was their idol. I mean, you know, he was the idol of the Panthers by any means necessary. It was part of, you know, the Panthers mantra. So he was an idol. I mean, there would have been no Panthers without Malcolm X, but Malcolm X, I'm sorry, my time sense is off, but Malcolm X had passed by the time.
The Panthers started in 65, which is around, wasn't Malcolm X assassinated in 65?
Yeah, I think they started in 66. So
66, okay.
Yeah, so I think he was gone, but he was their, you know, well, was their idol, you know, good or bad. I mean, there was some of that, you know, picture of Malcolm X with the rifle at the window that it was like the Panthers, you know, that maybe had a little bit too much influence on the Panthers, but you know.
Yes.
Just in terms, is this too loud? Okay. Just in terms of the music, there's a Stanford connection. The Chambers Brothers, Time Has Come Today. They moved to Stanford, and thank you, in 1968. That's when I moved up here with the drummer, may he rest in peace, Brian Keenan. And I had a privilege, I mean, what a counterpoint of an education when I was 18 years old to be living with the Chambers Brothers from Carthage, Mississippi, okay, in North Stamford, and feeling, we used to rent police when we had parties to make sure that we wouldn't be raided. Yeah, I mean, and we used to literally sit shiva, you know, we were on pins and needles when they'd go down south in 1969, are they coming home? Brian was acutely aware of this. There was a woman named Maxine who was white, who had a crush on Joe, and they were leaving the hotel together down south. Brian was very attentive, very aware, and he was looking all around, and there were pickup trucks and guys with their guns and, you know, rifles and beer cans in the back of the pickup trucks, and the brothers always dressed with the big hats and the velvet pants. They were waiting for them to walk out, and Maxine's walking out with Joe. Brian would go up and just go, "Oh, Maxine," like he had something to tell her, and get Joe away so that they weren't riling any of the locals and provoking any trouble. But just so you know, I mean, and there's so many people don't remember the Chambers Brothers, it hurts my heart, or their contribution. But 1968, Stamford, Connecticut, that's when they moved here.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I remember the Chambers Brothers. Going uptown to Harlem.
Let us thank Stanley Nelson. We're so glad that we could share your film.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
I'd like to share with you that the Black Lens is going to be airing quarterly, right?
Yes.
And we just confirmed our next film, Through a Lens Darkly, by Thomas Allen Harris. It is a film about photography and the taking of images by Black photographers of Black subjects, and that will be in February, I think February 26th.
Yes. Can we give a big round of thanks to Stanley Nelson and Harriette Cole? Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to have you here at the Avon. Thank you all for coming. Please come back. We are always 365 days a year showing something interesting that you can talk about. World movies, independent movies, the Black Lens series. We have a lot going on. Thank you for being a part of it, and thank you both.
Thank you.